Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are grabbing the third rail of polite conversation with both hands. We are talking about God, atheism, and power.
And we're not just, debating theology here.
No, we're asking the really uncomfortable questions. Is religion just a weapon for tyrants to control people?
Is the God of the Old Testament, when you read it literally, a dictator?
And maybe the biggest question of all,
Mm.
why does faith persist? Even with all our science, is it just a delusion or is it something else? A cry of distress.
To get into all that, we're using Pauline Siegel's book, The Meek and the Militant, as our guide.
And Siegel's a really interesting choice for this.
He is. He was a Marxist literary critic, a Shakespeare scholar of all things, which sounds very academic.
A little bit. Yeah.
But what it means is he looks at religious history like a story, a narrative about power, about economics, and, about human suffering. His whole argument is that you can't understand God without understanding the society that created him.
So that's our journey today. We're going to go from the cruel God of the Enlightenment atheists to the merchant God of Islam.
Look at the pagan roots of Christian rituals.
And finally, try to figure out why religion is still such a huge force in the modern world. It's going to be a wild ride. But before we jump in, I have to do the quick housekeeping bit. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
It really does help us keep making these deep dives for you.
It does. Okay. So let's start where the modern fight really began, the Enlightenment.
Right. Back in the 18th century, you have the French materialists, thinkers like Holbach and Diderot. And when they looked at religion, they basically saw a conspiracy.
That sounds a little tinfoil hat for a bunch of philosophers.
Well, from their perspective, it was a trick, a deliberate deception cooked up by priests and kings to keep everyone else ignorant and obedient.
So just a tool for control.
Purely. Holbach wrote this book, Common Sense, where he makes the case that if you actually read the Bible literally, the character of God isn't a loving father. He's a God of armies, jealous, vindictive, and frankly, cruel.
And Siegel pulls some examples from Holbach that are, well, they're pretty shocking. Let's start with the story of Elisha in the Second Kings.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic. So Elisha the prophet is walking, and some children start mocking him.
They call him bald head. That's the insult. Go away, bald head.
Such a petty thing. And the response, it is not turn the other cheek.
Not even close. Elisha curses them in the name of the Lord. And then what happens?
2 bears come out of the woods and maul 42 of the children.
42. For a playground insult.
The takeaway for the Enlightenment critics was simple. This is about terror. It's a raw demonstration of arbitrary power. Don't question authority, or the bears will come for you.
And it gets darker. The story of the Midianites. Moses orders the slaughter of all the male children and all the non-virgin women.
But he gives a very specific order about the young virgins.
Keep it for yourselves.
Right. And Siegel highlights this amazing debate between Thomas Paine and Bishop Watson over this very passage. Paine calls it what it sounds like.
Brutality. Sexual slavery.
And Bishop Watson defends it as an act of mercy.
Mercy. How on earth do you get to mercy from that?
His logic, if you can call it that, was that they were allowed to live. And in ancient warfare, not being killed, even if you became a captive, was seen as grace. But for Paine, this was proof that this God was just a reflection of brutal ancient kings.
And then there's Jephthah, the judge who makes a vow to God.
He vows to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house if God gives him a military victory.
He's probably expecting, what, a goat? A sheep?
Of course. But instead, it's his daughter.
And he goes through with it. He burns her as an offering.
So the Enlightenment thinkers looked at all this and said, how can you worship a being that demands this? If he exists, he's a monster.
And if he doesn't exist, the priests are liars.
Precisely. They also attacked the whole first cause argument for God's existence. If the universe needs a creator, well, who created the creator?
The infinite regress problem.
They just argued that matter is eternal. It doesn't need a divine spark. But, and this is the big pivot in Siegel's book, the Enlightenment guys had a huge blind spot.
They successfully attacked the logic of religion.
They did. But they totally failed to understand the sociology of it. They thought if they just pointed out the logical contradictions in the bears, religion would just vanish.
But it didn't. Not by a long shot.
No, because they couldn't explain why it was there in the first place if it's just a conspiracy. They didn't get what it did for people.
Which brings us to the elephant in the room, Marx. You can't talk about this stuff without talking about the opium of the people.
Right, and it's probably the most famous misquote in all of sociology. The popular idea is that Marx is just sneering. calling religious people, drug addicts who are too stoned to see their own oppression.
And if you just take away their drugs, they'll wake up and start the revolution.
But Siegel argues that's completely the wrong way to read it. Marx wasn't just calling it a drug. He also called it the sigh of the oppressed creature.
And the heart of a heartless world.
Exactly. It's surprisingly poetic and it's empathetic. He's saying that when the world is crushing you, religion isn't the disease.
It's the painkiller. It's the only thing that makes the pain bearable.
You got it. So the Enlightenment thinkers were basically trying to rip the painkiller out of the hands of a patient who was actively being tortured without ever stopping the torture itself.
That's a powerful analogy.
And Siegel traces this need for a painkiller all the way back, from the fear of nature, things like lightning or disease that early humans couldn't control.
Animism, right? The idea that there are spirits in the trees and the storms.
Yes, because you're helpless against the weather, so you have to believe you can somehow influence it by praying or making an offering.
Okay, that makes sense. But we have meteorology now. You don't fear lightning in the same way.
We controlled nature, but we lost control of society. Siegel's argument is that in a modern class society, things like a market crash or sudden unemployment, they hit you just like a storm.
Out of nowhere, and you're completely helpless.
You're helpless again. So we just projected that power onto a single omnipotent God. We went from fearing the spirits of the storm to fearing the invisible hand of the market, personified as God.
And that idea of God evolving.
Yeah.
Siegel shows how that happened within Judaism.
He does. Originally, the God of the early Israelites, Yahweh, is described as a tribal war god. He's not that different from the gods of the neighboring peoples.
He fights for his tribe. He gets jealous of other gods.
But then comes the catastrophe, the Babylonian exile. The Jewish kingdom is destroyed, the temple is torn down, and the people are deported.
In the ancient world, that should have been the end. Your God lost? You start worshiping the winner's God?
That's what should have happened. But the Jewish priesthood did something absolutely brilliant. They flipped the entire narrative.
They said this didn't happen because our God was weak?
No, they said it happened because our God is so incredibly powerful that he is the universal God of all nations.
So he was using the Babylonians, a foreign empire, as his instrument.
To punish his own people for not following his laws. It's an incredible psychological reversal.
It turns a humiliating defeat into proof of your God's supreme power. We aren't losers, we're just being disciplined by the boss of the universe.
It made their suffering meaningful, and is why the religion survived. And Christianity did something very similar when it spread into the Roman Empire.
This is where we get into the pagan roots.
Yeah.
Siegel talks a lot about the mystery religions that were already popular.
Yes. If you look at something like Mithraism, which was a Persian cult huge in the Roman army, the parallels are just undeniable.
What kind of parallels?
Well, they had a form of baptism. They had a communal meal of bread and wine. They celebrated the rebirth of the sun god on December 25th.
The winter solstice, when the days start getting longer again.
Correct. And then you have the myths of gods like Osiris and Attis, gods who die and are resurrected. These stories were everywhere, long before Jesus.
So the point isn't just to say Christianity copied them.
No, the point is to show that the early church was syncretic. It blended things.
The theological merger.
Exactly. To make this new Jewish sect appealing to the wider Roman world, the church adopted the rituals and symbols those people already knew and understood. You don't cancel the popular winter festival, you just rename it Christmas.
Let's shift over to Islam, because Siegel's analysis of it is so specific, he calls it a commercial theology.
He does, and he's drawing on the work of the scholar Charles Torrey. The idea is that the language of the Quran is deeply rooted in the language of commerce.
Which would make sense, given Mecca was a trading hub.
And Muhammad himself came from that world, so God is described almost like an ideal merchant.
And life is a transaction.
Life is a trade. The believer sells their soul and their possessions to God in exchange for a guaranteed reward, paradise. The infidel, on the other hand, makes a bad bargain. They go bankrupt in the afterlife.
That's a very different psychology from the father and child relationship in Christianity.
It is. In that Christian framework, you're a child. You're dependent on grace and forgiveness. In this reading of Islam, you're a merchant fulfilling a contract. If you pay your side of the deal, faith, and submission, then God, as the ultimate honest merchant, is obligated to deliver.
It removes some of the ambiguity, it provides certainty.
It does. And Siegel also points out this great irony in the whole East versus West moral divide. For centuries, Western Christians saw Islam as sensual and hedonistic.
Pointing to things like polygamy or the descriptions of paradise.
Right. But now the dynamic has flipped. Many in the Muslim world look at the West and see it as the truly hedonistic culture, obsessed with materialism, alcohol, and sex.
It just shows how relative these things are.
Hmm.
But Siegel doesn't stop there. He also looks at Eastern religions, which we in the West tend to romanticize.
We do. We think of Hinduism and Buddhism as purely peaceful, meditative, not like the violent Abrahamic faiths.
But he talks about the juggernaut?
The juggernaut, this massive festival cart for the god Vishnu. Now, the British exaggerated the stories of people throwing themselves under the wheels, but the social reality it represents is key. Hinduism, Siegel says, is theologically flexible. It can absorb anything: polytheism, monotheism, even atheism.
Yeah.
But the one thing you cannot question is the caste system. The social control is rigid, even if the theology isn't.
And Buddhism has its own contradictions.
Huge contradictions. It started as an atheistic philosophy. Buddha wasn't a god. But over time, it became a religion where Buddha is worshipped like a god. And for all its talk of nonviolence, you had powerful Buddhist empires that waged constant war.
So it seems no matter the origin, religion eventually bends to serve the state.
It bends to serve power. Which brings us to the modern world. You'd think, after all this, religion would have just faded away. But in the United States, it's arguably stronger than in many places.
The Great American Paradox.
Mhm.
Why is the U.S. so much more religious than Europe?
Siegel's theory is fascinating. He says it's because of the separation of church and state.
That feels backwards. Shouldn't a state-sponsored church make a country more religious?
You'd think so, but no. In Europe, the state churches became, well, boring. They were part of the government bureaucracy, they were guaranteed tax money, they got lazy.
But in the U.S.,
It was a free market of faith. The churches had to compete, they had to hustle to get people in the pews, or they'd go out of business.
the competition made them more dynamic, more emotional, more responsive to what people wanted.
Exactly, and then the Cold War gave it a massive booster shot.
Right. Suddenly, being religious became a marker of being American.
To be American was to believe in God. To be a communist was to be godless. That's when "In God We Trust" goes on the money and "Under God" is added to the pledge. It cemented religion as a patriotic duty.
But, and this is the final crucial twist in Siegel's narrative, religion isn't always a conservative force.
No, absolutely not. And this is where we have to talk about liberation theology.
In places like Nicaragua with the Sandinistas, you had priests and nuns and ordinary believers joining a Marxist revolution.
They weren't reading the Bible and seeing a message of "obey your rulers." They were reading the Gospels and seeing a revolutionary Jesus.
The Jesus who condemned the rich and stood with the poor.
Exactly. They reinterpreted their faith as a call to build a just society on earth right now, not just wait for a reward in heaven.
And the Marxist response, according to Siegel, was to support them.
It was. The argument is that you should never try to ban religion. That just creates martyrs. Instead, you should ally with religious people who are fighting for the same goals of social justice.
So you don't fight the idea of God.
You fight the social conditions that make people need the painkiller in the first place. You can't argue religion away with logic. As long as there is oppression and misery, people will need the sigh of the oppressed. You have to heal the wound before you can take away the opium.
It's an incredible way to frame it all. Religion isn't just one thing. It's not just truth or lies. It's a mirror of our entire history.
It evolves from fearing a thunderstorm to fearing a stock market crash.
It's used by tyrants to justify massacres, but it's also used by the poor to find the strength to fight back. It really is the language we've used to talk about our suffering.
And our hope.
So that brings us to the final provocative thought, which comes right out of Siegel's work. If we ever actually did it, if humanity solved its biggest social problems, poverty, war, that feeling of helplessness, would God vanish? If we no longer need a Father in heaven to save us from the misery on earth, what happens to faith itself?
That is the ultimate question.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.